The waitress was his girlfriend Edita. The owner of the restaurant had no say in the matter because he simply had to hire her. Welcome to another episode of Criminality Patrol. As you know, from time to time we go back to those old gangster stories from years ago. But these aren't years, I would say, from before the war. These are the years from the beginning of this century, so the 2000s. So if we look at it, it's actually relatively recent. We come back to them either because of stories that were somehow loud, or also because, despite about 20 years passing, these cases are still being resolved. That's exactly the case here. Even though it started in 2002, it's only now that this case has gone to court, because right now there's a resolution in this case. As you know, I've often said that those were exceptional years, the most difficult ones. Also for the police, where I was working at the time, a lot of different kinds of gangs, criminal groups. Practically every big and small town had its own criminal group, its own gang. The police and prosecutor's office were basically weak. A new police force was just being formed, I would say. The year 2000, that's when the Central Bureau of Investigation was just established. Today it's the Police Investigation Bureau. So those were just the beginnings as well. Gangsters, well, they competed with each other, and I'd say very fiercely. Many of them died. It's hard to say how many, but we can estimate with reasonable accuracy that about 200 were definitely killed, shot during their conflicts. Several hundred others simply disappeared. Some of them fled abroad. They're probably still living there. Others are buried somewhere in the forests. Even when I was making an episode about a gang or a group like Capone, I used the phrase that in the forests near Sonch, there were more buried corpses than mushrooms. But of course, that's a bit of an exaggeration. However, it does capture the atmosphere of those times to some extent. I invite you to watch the next episode. We've mentioned the Pruszków Mafia several times, for example. The Pruszków Mafia, which for over 10 years was the dominant group in Poland. They practically ruled Poland. Of course, I mean the criminal side of things. Other groups were subordinate to them. And no one was really able to challenge the Pruszków Mafia. But its decline also came. That was already the year 2002. It was in 2002 that the Pruszków Mafia's decline began. In 1999, Pershing was shot. Massa gave testimony. There are arrests, there are detentions, and the group practically ceases to exist. But a huge legacy of the Pruszkowski Mafia remains. Enormous opportunities, and into this place, other groups are trying to take the place of the Pruszkowski. These groups, of course, are fighting among themselves. We mentioned, for example, the group of mutants, the group of finger cutters. Today we'll talk about one such, actually very narrow, or I would say small fragment of everything that was happening back then. The murder of Krzysztof. He had the nickname Hiszpan. He was the leader of the Grochowska group. He was connected with Wolomin. He also, so to speak, claimed the hope that he would take over part of the inheritance after Pruszków. We're talking about this case because despite these 23 years, the case is still ongoing in court in Warsaw. Krzysztof K., nicknamed Hiszpan, started from the bottom, like practically everyone in this business. He was a bodyguard and he was also Niewiadomski's driver. Wiesław Niewiadomski, who also became something of a legend in the criminal world. Actually, the Niewiadomski family, because it wasn't just Wiesław, but also his brother Henryk and his nephew Paweł. In some way, this family also shows what was happening back then, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Going back to Krzysztof, he actually started his career by being the driver for Wisław Niewiadomski. Wisław Niewiadomski himself is often said to have led, or people confuse him with leading, the Wołomin Mafia. In reality, he was the head of the Ząbkowska group. The boss of this group, I'd say it doesn't really matter which group he led, because all of that can actually get mixed up. He is the leader of one of the criminal groups. Wisław Niewiadomski himself, 6 February 1998, is shopping at the delicatessen on Powieka Street in Praga. He finishes shopping and gets into his Pontiac. Suddenly a man appears, a killer with a submachine gun, fires a burst, and that's how Wisław Niewiadomski, nicknamed Wariat, dies on the spot. He was only 52 years old. He practically ran all those businesses with his brother Henrik, nicknamed Dziad. It's also very well-known last name, well-known nickname. Grandpa, however, is serving time in the year, a sentence in 2007 that probably saved his life, because already in 1995 he was in General Dziad, that is Wisław's brother, was an avid pigeon keeper. He loved pigeons, he loved watching them fly around. I think he even entered them in some races. He had his own pigeon loft in Ząbki. One evening, a killer broke into that pigeon loft with a machine gun. He killed everyone in that pigeon loft. It turned out later that he had killed 3 people who were completely uninvolved. Dziad wasn't in the pigeon loft then, so he survived. Later, there were various attempts on his life. He always managed to come out of those attempts unscathed. In the end, he ends up in prison and serves his sentence. In August 2007, someone shot his son, Pavel. Pavel is dying in the hospital. It's August. Sam Niewiadomski, Pavel's father, his sentence is ending at this moment. He was supposed to be released in October 2007. While still in prison, he played ping pong. He was probably upset that a few months earlier his son had been shot while he was playing ping pong. He had a stroke and also he died. He was 59 years old. His son was 33. The story of the Niewiadomski family shows how things went back then, that none of them knew the day or the hour, that they killed each other, shot at each other, and planned assassinations. Paweł's threat, the son of the old man, will come up again later in this story. However, that was also a time when a certain kind of legend about these gangsters was being created. In fact, if we look at it from today's perspective, some of their actions were actually astonishing. A story that basically became legendary and went down in history is the one connected with the theft of 5 tons, let me repeat, 5 tons, of security paper that was supposed to be used for printing banknotes. Well, it was real paper for producing real money, and indeed Poland bought 5 tons of such paper in Germany at that time. Well, it was a special operation controlled by the Special Services. The Office for State Protection was overseeing the transport of those 5 tons of paper, and what happens next? Well, the Niewiadomski brothers simply stole those 5 tons of paper. Well, that was an embarrassment for practically all the services. The gangsters stole 5 tons of paper. They wanted to make rubles out of it. That paper was supposed to be used for producing rubles because, well, it could have caused incredible, I would say, meltdowns on the currency markets. Well, the introduction of probably millions, maybe billions of rubles into the Eastern market, because that's exactly what they intended to do. was supposed to destabilize the Moscow bank altogether. That's what was estimated at the time. People started to puzzle over it, and I think looking back today that if it had really... the Niewiadomski brothers had produced those rubles and released them onto the Moscow market, then both Putin's situation and today's war would look completely different. However, that's not exactly how it turned out. I say not exactly because they started talking. There were even negotiations between the police and the gangsters. They started coming to an agreement about what was said there and how. That probably remains a secret, although some people know about it. They started talking with the gangsters. In the end, it turned out that out of those 5 tons of paper, after those talks, I would also say with the generals of the Polish police, they decided that they returned 3.7 tons just as expected. However, from what they had left, which was 1 ton and 300 kilograms indeed, they produced rubles and introduced most of them to the Eastern market. But going back to Hiszpan, he had his favorite cafe, a restaurant where he used to hang out. Basically, it was his office because he had a permanent table there. At that table, he handled all kinds of business, as befits this type of gangster. The restaurant was named Szemrana. It was located right next to the Rozhitsky Bazaar. Of course, he had security there. He also had, I would say, a kind of care because his girlfriend, Edita, was a waitress there. The owner of the restaurant had no say in the matter because he simply had to hire her. There the Spaniard would meet with various kinds of business partners. There he discussed various kinds of transactions. The Spaniard, having received an apology, did not expect an attempt on his life. And all of this referred to what had happened exactly 17 days earlier on September 3rd, 2002. At that time, in front of the Marcus gym, there was an attack on 2 members of the Prague group. When they left the gym, a shooter appeared. He started shooting at them. Arthur died at the scene. By some miracle, the second member of the Praga group, Gauss, avoided death. And then the guys from the Praga group started wondering who could have ordered the attack on them. Who could have been behind it? They came to the conclusion that it was Hiszpan. There was no other alternative. There was no other way out. They only knew that they had to repay Hiszpan. Of course, this meant that Hiszpan had to die. The Praga group decides to take revenge. Everyone in the community knew that Hiszpan usually hung out at Szemrana. That's where he did his business. They knew almost everything. They knew which table it was. They came up with a plan, and they set the date for September 20, 2002. That evening, because all of this happens in the evening, Edita is already at the place. Of course, she's working as a waitress. She takes orders. Hiszpan is sitting at his, that's what he said, his official table. He really didn't expect that there could be an attempt on his life, because he's sitting with his back to the entrance. If he watched Westerns, he would know that if there's any danger, you sit facing the entrance. That way you can see who comes in, whether any potential threat appears. But he's sitting at the table together with the owner of this place. Both of them were talking. The owner of this place himself, when testifying in court today, says that indeed at some point after 9 post meridium, because Hiszpan is sitting there around 9 after 9 post meridium, first a couple came in and then 2 men appeared. They were acting strange from the moment they walked in. They were dressed in military jackets, jeans, but I think they also had some kind of makeup on their faces because, as the owner of the place remembers, they had some kind of lines. It wasn't exactly makeup, it was something strange on their faces. At first he even thought that they might be some kind of prank, that maybe they were the Spaniards' friends, but nothing like that. They walked up to the bar. They pulled out their pistols and started shooting right away. They shot accurately. It was clear that they had experience. 10 bullets hit Hiszpana. He was shot in the chest and in the stomach. He just fell dead onto that table, and the owner of the place simply hid behind it. He watched those two killers to see if they would shoot at him too, but they had no such intention. One of them just gestured for him to stay quiet, and then they simply left the place. The place also has surveillance, or at least it did back then. The police secured it. Somehow that surveillance was poor. There's basically not much you can see there, except that at the moment of the attack, some man is walking along the premises. At the moment when the shots were fired, he just calmly walks away. It looked like he was part of the attacker's security. You can see another man in the parking lot, who presumably has a pistol in his hand. And you can see another man who comes out of the place after those shots. This is presumably one of the attackers. He raises his hand to hip level as if he were hiding something under his jacket. We can assume that he simply hid the pistol, calmly, basically like the other two. He walks away, and that's how the whole situation ends. Of course, those were the years when no one, even if they had knowledge, and there were probably quite a few such people, decided to testify. Everyone was just afraid. The police even accurately identified those who could have done it. They even correctly suspected who was behind it, who carried out the attack. But there was no evidence, and that was basically the whole investigation. It was discontinued. Years were passing by as well. There's an article like that, we often mention it too. An article that talks about extraordinary mitigation of punishment, about the so-called small crown witness. What does it mean? Yes, to put it simply, if a gangster or a criminal talks about a case or explains a case that was unknown, or the perpetrators were unknown to the prosecutor's office or police, he will discuss this case. In this case, there must be at least 3 criminals. Then he can count on exceptional case mitigation. And if we look at the verdicts being handed down, these criminals really have something to fight for. Sometimes a verdict is handed down, say 15 years in prison. This criminal says that he will now talk about the crime or say who committed a particular crime. And this sentence, if it turns out to be true, is reduced for him, and out of those 15 years he gets only 2. Well, that's really something to fight for. And it's similar in this case. First, the man who was dealing drugs started talking. A certain Piotr, he is also a witness in this case. He talked about the fact that right after the murder in front of the gym, Marcus, well, especially Gauss, who was the one who survived the attack, was particularly determined to go after the Spaniard. They decided that he would be shot. The strike team was, of course, supposed to be members of the Praga group. A certain Kuba was assigned to carry out the execution itself, and a man with the pseudonym Sultan. Sultan was also, I would say, a kind of legend of those times. A Chechen, an exceptionally ruthless, cruel man, a killer who worked on commission. Well, everyone in Warsaw was afraid of him. So he had his own reputation. He was especially determined to get Hiszpana because before that gym, his friend also died there, that is Arthur. So he had no qualms about shooting Hiszpana as well. Besides those two, there was also someone named Gonzo. I would say he was a kind of logistician, meaning the person who was supposed to get the weapons. Those weapons were acquired, probably taken out from one of the factories. Most often it was unregistered weapons. Workers at the arms factories very often took advantage of the fact that they had access to parts of weapons. They would take out individual parts and then the weapon would be assembled. Of course, these weapons didn't have any serial numbers, and that's exactly the kind of weapon Gonzo got. That was his nickname. In one of the basements in Warsaw, he test-fired that weapon. A witness confirmed it. Piotr even showed where it was done. And indeed, after almost 20 years, the police went there, dug 2 bullets out of the plaster in the wall. And then they compared them with the bullets that were found in the Spaniard's body. Everything matched. It was the same weapon. Well, after so many years, after more than 20 years, those bullets were already heavily corroded. But without a doubt, it was the same one. Weapon. All of this was later confirmed by one of the people associated with Hiszpan himself. Of course, after Hiszpan was killed, his group planned revenge, meaning to kill those guys. Well, how could it be otherwise? They made a list. This list was made by a certain Arthur from Hiszpan's group. There were 4 names on that list: Kuba, Gauss, Sultan, and a certain Jacek Z, who was the leader of that group at the time. It was planned, of course, that they would be shot in retaliation for the murder of the Spaniard. The first arrest in this case, the first of these arrests didn't happen until August 2023. 3 people were arrested. That's Kuba, that's Gauss, and also Gonzo. The Sultan himself was not arrested because in 2006 he committed suicide. The trial began, the trial is ongoing. These are the first hearings. None of the accused today have admitted guilt so far. I would say they led a fairly normal life. One was working when he was detained at his workplace. The other one probably felt that the police were on his trail because he was hiding in Ukraine. In total, 3 men will be held responsible or are being held responsible today for the murder of the Spaniard. It looked like this. For this very act of retaliation, as I mentioned earlier, Kuba and Sultan were assigned. However, when it came to planning, 4 people were involved. That includes Gonzo, who provided the weapons. That also includes Gauss. Also planned how all of this will be done. These are, as I said, the first hearings. The prosecutor's office is also participating in these hearings. A group of people associated with them then, with Hiszpan. These are also Hiszpan's wife, lover, and concubine. This is also a kind of, I would say, legend of those years. People wanted to live that way. They wanted to live fast, to live rich. Coming back to Ziad, after all, he was the one who had a casino, a hotel in Częstochowa called Vegas. He had a house that was 1,200 square meters. However, in the case of the Spaniard, the 35-year-old, as you can see, during the trial, his wife, lover, and mistress testified. But as it turns out, those probably weren't all the women in his life at that time. Well, all 3 of these women who, so to speak, had intimate relations with him now have different lives. His wife and the mother of his child says that she waited many years for this matter to be resolved. I'm also saying that Hiszpan probably didn't expect that an attempt on his life was being planned. Edita, the waitress, his lover, said that she also doesn't know much about the case, that indeed that evening she was working as a waitress, that Hiszpan came to the place before 9 post-meridian, but she took the order, went to the back, and, well, she heard some bangs, but it seemed to her that it was just kids setting off fireworks. When she came out, she saw Hiszpan already dead, lying on the table, and she had a hysterical fit. But she knows little about the case itself. There's also his partner involved in this case, who says they lived together for 15 years and have a daughter together. Today, that partner is just a regular office worker. She says she suspected that Hiszpan had relationships with other women, but it seems that it just didn't bother her. But there's also another thread that appears in this. I told you about this about Pavel, who was the old man's son. This Pavel, who was shot in 2007. It looks like Pavel, nicknamed Marufka, also had a grudge against Hiszpan because it seemed that Hiszpan stole his girlfriend Marta. So that's already the fourth woman at the same time who seems to have been involved with Hiszpan. And it seems that Pavel was also planning an attack on him. Life. Well, that's one of the threads of this case. Presumably this will continue to be clarified. It will also be clarified who else helped with the assassination. Because all of this indicates that someone from the premises, well, maybe it was someone from the staff, maybe someone who pretended to be a guest. He entered the premises and informed whether the Spaniard had protection that evening. There is evidence that someone was there because Piotr, who is testifying in this case, is a key witness. He said that that evening he collected SIM cards from people who were informing or contacting each other on the night when the murder took place. So this will obviously be clarified. As you remember, some couple entered that place earlier. It can't be ruled out that this couple entered just to look around and see if the Spaniard had any security in the place. Of course, all the suspects face a life sentence. As you can see, like I said at the beginning, more than 23 years have passed, and now these cases are also coming to light. It was a special period in history of Polish criminalistics, criminology, and law enforcement. A special period, so to speak, in the existence of this type of gangsters who lived, I would say, fast and rich, but as you can see, they also died quickly. It's a colorful story. I think it will be a kind of legend, like the legends that once arose in the Wild West, because after all, those were also often bandits who shot at each other. Sometimes the situations were downright grotesque, because as you know from our stories, gangsters had all sorts of colorful nicknames like Kilbasa, Wariat, Ziad, Bolo, Pisa, Marchewa. I could really go on for a long time. And the owner of that place, Shemranish, probably amused the court a bit because he said that gangsters would party at his place, and as is often the case during such events, people would pass on dedications. And one evening he had to pass on a dedication. It was a song, I think, by the Band Boys, as far as I remember, the song Freedom and Liberty, and the dedication went something like this. And now, from the axe to the chain, the song Let Freedom and Liberty Live. Well, whether laugh or cry, it's your choice. That's how it was back then. That's today's story. Of course, subscribe to our channel, and as always, take care.